Today, I'm talking about What's New About Fake News by Jessica Pepp, Elliot Michaelson, and Rachel Sterken. Now, one thing to note, this is a very contemporary topic. Even just a year and a half after the original publication of this paper, some of their examples feel a little bit dated. And I'm guessing that if you're watching this video again, even a few months from now, or especially a few years from now, there will be even more to say about this, that some aspects of this paper are probably not going to feel up to whatever the present moment looks like at that time. But these authors are continuing work on this project. They already, in fact, have another paper that's out, and they have grants to work on several more papers in the future on this and related topics. And before we go too deep into this, I just want to disclose I'm good friends with Elliot Michaelson. We used to live a few doors down from each other in Los Angeles, but I don't know the other authors of this paper. And now one thing I'll say, their view about fake news is not the same as everyone else's, but they have their own view. I'll put in the description some links to other papers that they discuss extensively. But their basic idea is that fake news is not news that is about a fake story. They are saying what makes fake news fake is that it's not really news. It's not produced like news, but it's treated as though it was news. It may be about a fake story or maybe about a real story, but the important thing on their account is that it's not really news, but it's treated as though it were news. And as we'll see, that makes their account different from some of the other accounts that other authors have given. And I think another point that they want to make is that in some sense, there's nothing new about fake news. There has been fake news for centuries. They give examples even from the 18th century, but there is something new in that the rise of social media has enabled a new form of interaction where you can share a story and you can treat it as though it was news, whether or not it is. And then that new way of dealing with stories has made this phenomenon become much more common. They aren't trying to diagnose what are all the problems with fake news. They're not trying to say whether fake news is bad or good. They're just trying to say what fake news is so that in future research on this, we can try to analyze those questions. Okay. On March 4th, 2016, the National Enquirer reported that Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was murdered by a high-end prostitute employed by the CIA. On October 30th, 2016, a Twitter account purportedly belonging to a Jewish New York lawyer, but in fact run by a white supremacist, claimed that the NYPD had unearthed emails confirming the existence of a pedophilia ring run by prominent Democratic lawmakers out of a pizza joint in Washington, D.C. Thus began Pizzagate, a story that spread from Twitter and 4chan to a variety of right-wing websites and eventually the Turkish mainstream media. Both of these are recent paradigm instances of fake news. Yet, as we shall see below, there are some significant differences between the two cases. The former, that is the National Enquirer story, is largely contiguous with a type of fake news that has been around for some time. It is produced by organizations resembling real newsrooms, many of which employ real reporters and do occasionally break real news. The National Enquirer really did break the story about John Edwards' extramarital affair, for instance. And for those of you that don't remember, John Edwards was the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats in 2004 and was a prominent contender in the 2008 Democratic primary. I don't remember if this story was before that primary or afterwards. I think it was later. The National Enquirer is distributed in tabloid form and via websites. And in case you don't know, tabloid actually just refers to the size and shape of the paper that it's on. Just picture the tabloid newspapers at the supermarket checkout counter rather than the more standard, I forget what the term is, but the other fold that newspapers often have where they're a bit bigger and so they fold one more time. So the latter, that is the Pizzagate story, is a new sort of fake news, which is interestingly different in a number of ways. A, it is often produced by individuals, as opposed to an organization like the National Enquirer. B, it is often distributed entirely via social networks like Twitter and Facebook, as opposed to in print. And C, it relies for its spread not on any sort of physical infrastructure, but rather on the function of those networks, specifically via sharing. In this essay, we will pursue two interconnected goals. First, we will develop a preliminary understanding of what fake news is. On our account, neither deceptive intentions on the part of originators nor deceived beliefs on the part of consumers are essential to fake news. We will compare our account with recent efforts by some other philosophers, all of whom have argued that characterizing fake news requires some appeal to the intentional state of the agent or agents who produced the content in question. Against such views, we will argue that what newer types of fake news, like Pizzagate, reveal is that fake news can arise without any of the efforts or expectations to deceive or mislead that these philosophers have taken to be necessary. In fact, we will argue that attention to the new fake news reveals how even older forms of fake news could have been produced in this sort of way, even if they actually were not. That is, one of the important points they're going to say is it's not the story itself that makes something fake news, it's how people treat the story and as compared to how it was actually produced. That mismatch between how it's treated and how it's produced is what they say is characteristic of fake news, as opposed to anything that's in the story itself. Our second goal will be to try to better understand certain features of the contemporary speech landscape that we take to be characteristic of the new fake news. In particular, we think that the speech act of sharing is characteristic of, if not essential to, the new fake news. We will explain why we take this to be a specific sort of speech act, how we think it differs from the types of sharing that people were able to partake in before the advent of social media networks, and why all of this matters. In short, what consideration of this new act of sharing reveals is that the infrastructure essential to the spread of fake news, and thus, on our account, essential to fake news itself, has shifted radically in the past few decades. That, in turn, raises the question of what sorts of responsibility ought to be borne by the corporate social networks that have effectively become, structurally speaking at least, the publishers of fake news. A brief note on what this essay is and is not. Importantly, it is not an attempt to capture all the diverse and very often politically loaded ways that the term fake news is used in contemporary life. That is, people call things fake news all the time, and sometimes we agree with them when they're calling things fake news. Sometimes we think that them calling something fake news is itself some other sort of interesting or uh, deceptive, perhaps, media strategy. They're not going to try to analyze how do people use the word fake news in all those ways. Rather, what we hope to do is capture something of the essence of a social phenomenon that has been around for some time, but came to particular prominence around the time of the 2016 US presidential election. The project is partially descriptive and partially ameliorative. We hope to offer a way of thinking about this phenomenon that both captures a significant amount of what motivated people to start talking about fake news around this time, and that could be useful for practical considerations regarding potential protections and regulations of our media environment. That is, when they say it's descriptive, they're saying, what are the things that people have been calling fake news? And it's ameliorative in the sense of wanting to figure out how to make things better. And that may mean changing which sorts of things we call fake news. In other words, we hope to better understand a certain fairly coherent social phenomenon that we take to often be picked out by the term fake news, one that we think manifests in importantly different ways in different sorts of media environments, and to offer a way of thinking about this phenomenon that will prove useful in efforts to grapple with its political and ethical dimensions and effects. We do not mean to commit ourselves here to the claim that the use of the term fake news is essential to carrying out this project. As Habgood Coote has argued, it might well be that to combat the sort of phenomenon we are interested in, we would do best to stop calling it fake news. While we disagree, we will avoid getting into these issues here. Interested readers are encouraged to look at our other paper for thoughts on this matter. And I'll include a link to that paper in the description. Okay, section 1, what is fake news? We propose to define fake news as follows. Fake news is the broad spread of stories treated by those who spread them as having been produced by standard journalistic practices, but that have not in fact been produced by such practices. This definition locates the fakeness of fake news in its status as news, that is, as opposed to in its status as truth. News that's produced in the ordinary way but is false doesn't count as fake news on their account. Something that is true, that pretends to be produced by a news agency but isn't, is fake news on their account. Fake news is treated as news by those who spread it, but because it is not produced in the manner in which real news is produced, i.e. by standard journalistic practices, it is not real news. Four important components of this definition need further elaboration: story, broad spread, standard journalistic practices, and treating as. The requisite notion of story is quite broad. It encompasses any narrative or report of events, real or imaginary. Spread is a matter of how many people read the story and treat it as news. One or two people treating a story as having been produced by standard journalistic practices, when in fact it was not, does not seem to be enough for that story to be fake news. Fake news requires a broad spread of a story. The question of how broad is broad enough for fake news is hard to answer precisely. The required breadth would seem to vary with the field of interest for the story. For instance, if a story concerns local politics in a small town, the field of interest for that story, that is, the group of people who are likely to care about the events it reports, might be just a few thousand residents of the town. For this story to become fake news, it might only need to be read and treated as news by 50 or so people. Imagine if the student newspaper did a story, or if someone thought there was a story in the student newspaper about you, and if a few of your friends happened to see it, would that be enough to count as fake news? It might have the same sort of effect on you that these sort of more national fake news stories have on other people. By contrast, for a story of national or international interest to become fake news would require a much larger circulation. It will not be among our aims here to give an analysis of standard journalistic practices. We take journalism to be a type of activity focused on, though not defined by, informing members of a society about events relevant to them as members of that society. Journalism is a dynamic social institution with gradual historical origins, mainly in Europe after the invention of the printing press, and forerunners. When exactly this social institution came into existence and where the boundaries of the concept of journalism lie are difficult questions that we will not try to answer. Nonetheless, certain practices do seem to be at least partly constitutive of the activity of journalism. It is these that we refer to by standard journalistic practices. We will say more about them in the next section. They don't go into a huge amount of depth about this, but it is worth thinking about. How does the news media work today? How did the news media work a century ago? How did the news media work 4 centuries ago? There wasn't really such a thing as the news media before the printing press. And so a lot of the practices of the news media are very culturally specific and probably have changed from decade to decade and century to century. And so that's part of why they don't want to give a definition of what is real news, because what real news is not like, is going to change from time to time and place to place and context to context. Think about the difference between the news content of a petroleum industry internal news report or newsletter that gets sent around every month versus Us Weekly or some sort of celebrity news like that, or any of the many, many, many different things that all get treated as news. Video game journalism, fashion journalism, political journalism, all these things have their own features, but if something gets treated as journalism, even though it isn't really journalism, that's what they're going to say is fake news. Finally, this notion of treating a story as having been produced in a certain way plays an important role in our understanding of fake news. In general, treating something as having a certain feature is not the same as believing that it has that feature. Often, we treat things as having certain features for certain purposes, even though we do not really believe that they have those features. So, for instance, one might treat a hobby as a business for tax purposes because the activity seems to meet enough of the IRS's criteria, while believing that it is still more of a hobby. Or one might treat a dear family friend as a family member for the purposes of Christmas gift giving without believing that the person is actually a family member. Another way of treating something as having a certain feature is to behave as if it has that feature. This also does not require believing that it has that feature. For instance, one might treat a comment as a compliment by responding with a smile and "thank you, that's nice of you to say," even if one believes the comment was an insult. Still, another way of treating something as having a certain feature is to decide to make that feature prominent in one's mental categorization of the thing. For instance, the prolific author Harlan Coben said in a 2015 interview, "Every successful author I've ever known still has to treat it as a job." But in the very same interview, he also said, "I don't want a real job. That's why I became a writer." What Coben seems to convey with these two claims is that if you want to be a successful writer, you have to categorize writing as a job in your mind so that you will do it regularly and diligently. This is consistent with failing to believe that it is, in fact, a job. There's clearly some overlap in these ways of treating something as having a certain feature, and they often go together. E.g., in acting as if a sarcastic comment is a compliment, one may also mentally categorize it as a compliment, and one may treat it as a compliment for purposes of the conversation. Treating a story as having been produced by standard journalistic processes, i.e. as genuine news, could be done in any of these overlapping ways. One might feel justified in citing the story during political arguments, thereby treating it as genuine news for purposes of political argumentation. One might include it in a dinner table description of the day's world events, thereby acting as if it's genuine news. One might focus on its status as news when using it as motivation to get one to take various kinds of political action, thereby making that feature prominent in one's mental categorization of the story. Note that that last one is about treating it to yourself as news to get yourself motivated to do things. And I think they're going to suggest a lot of the effects that fake news has is when people take it as real and motivate themselves on its basis, and not just when people take it as real or pretend it's real or treat it as real in talking to other people. None of these requires believing that the story is genuine news, i.e. that it was produced by standard journalistic practices. Of course, it might involve believing that, but it doesn't require believing that. This is an important feature of our definition because it is not clear to what extent those who consume and spread fake news stories actually believe them, or actually believe that they are instances of genuine journalism. So that's an interesting point. It may be that everyone believes that it is, or it may be that a bunch of people individually don't believe that it is, but end up treating as a group as though it was. It may be that the impetus to treat fake news stories as having been produced in the standard journalistic way comes more from their ability to serve as weapons against perceived political or social enemies, or as solidifiers among political allies, than from readers' beliefs in their status as genuine news. And here's a footnote. This is related to the phenomenon of blue lies, or lies that are purportedly told to benefit one's group. It has been suggested, for example, that supporters of Donald Trump do not see his frequent lying as bad because they take it to be done to promote their political side against enemies. In a similar way, those who spread fake news stories may view it as good to treat the stories as genuine news, even if they do not believe that they are, because doing so is favorable to some side they are on. Further, it may be that those who consume and spread fake news have an erroneous or premature understanding of what constitutes news and journalism in our new technological and communicative reality. In this case, consumers and spreaders of fake news may believe that certain stories count as news or as produced by genuine journalism, even though what counts as news and genuine journalism in the age of social media is yet to be determined or negotiated by society at large. Another noteworthy feature of our definition is that it does not require that fake news stories be substantially false. And here they say this is a contrast to some of the definitions by Regina Rini and Axel Gelfert and a few others. As mentioned above, the definition locates the fakeness of fake news in its status as news, understood here as the status of having been produced by standard journalistic processes, rather than in its content. Fake news is not genuine news because it has not been produced in the way that genuine news must be produced. Typically, it's also false, but this need not always be the case. Just as real news can turn out to contain errors, due either to honest mistakes or to breaks in journalistic standards, so too can fake news occasionally, and most likely accidentally, turn out to be true. Finally, our definition does not require any intention to deceive or mislead on the part of those who originate or spread fake news. This makes it quite different from several other definitions recently advanced by philosophers. We will take a quick look at three of these. All are attempts to characterize fake news in such a way as to capture both the more contemporary phenomenon often referred to by that name, as well as most of the work by publications like the National Enquirer or Weekly World News. We will continue to treat the Scalia example as a paradigm case of this latter form of fake news, that is the old kind of fake news, and Pizzagate as a paradigm case of the new fake news. Some other instances of the old sort of fake news would include anything from the Weekly World News' Bat Boy series, or the National Enquirer's 2015 story alleging that Hillary Clinton's deleted emails contained evidence that she's a lesbian. Some other instances of the new sort of fake news would include Trump's tweets about the size of the crowd at his inauguration, or the 2016 claim by Your Newswire that 25 million fraudulent votes had been cast in favor of Hillary Clinton. Footnote 8. The inauguration case is particularly interesting in light of the comment in the text above to the effect that standard journalistic processes and what counts as journalism may be in flux due to changes in media. Trump's tweets in this case might be seen simply as assertions by an individual speaker with no connection, pretended or otherwise, to news or journalistic processes. However, these tweets have been treated as paradigm instances of fake news. That's an interesting question. What is it to treat something as fake news if being fake news is treating something as real news? This is probably because tweeting by government officials, US presidents in particular, can have a semi-journalistic status. Just as White House press briefings deliver news to the public via the press, so White House tweets can deliver news without the press as middlemen. That is, they're saying when the president tweets, at least sometimes the president tweets as an announcement of national policy or as an announcement of a news story. And so treating a tweet about the size of the inauguration as though it had the same status as a tweet about new policy on immigration or on drug benefits or whatever it is might be a way of treating it as news, even if it wasn't produced in the same sort of way. There seems to be a similar status for corporate press releases. The issuing of these documents is something the press can report, but the documents themselves are already written as news. They are purpose-built to be treated as having been produced by standard journalistic practices. But whereas old-style press releases were also designed to be reported as events, the making of assertions by a government or corporation, in keeping with standard journalistic practices, today's tweets go directly to the public. This might make it easy for such stories, including Trump's tweets about the inauguration, to become fake news. I think it's worthwhile to look up some corporate press releases. For instance, look at the press releases from Moderna and Pfizer and AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson about their vaccine results. Those press releases are written in a way that is intended to be readable by the public, also intended to be readable by a newspaper journalist, and intended for a journalist to be able to just cut and paste text from there into the news story so that the corporate message gets broadcast directly to the people. Sometimes that's good, but sometimes it gets treated as though it was the real news, even if it isn't. The first definition of fake news that we will consider comes from Rini. So here's a different definition from Regina Rini. I'll have a link to her paper in the description below. A fake news story, according to her, is one that purports to describe events in the real world typically by mimicking the conventions of traditional media reportage, yet is known by its creators to be significantly false and is transmitted with the two goals of being widely retransmitted and of deceiving at least some of its audience. So, the key elements of Rini's definition of fake news stories are A, that they purport to describe real-world events, B, that their content is known by their creators to be false, and C, that they are created with the goal of being widely disseminated and deceptive to at least some readers. Here's another definition from Gelfert. Fake news is the deliberate presentation of typically false or misleading claims as news, where the claims are misleading by design. Gelfert further explains that for a claim to be misleading by design is for it, A, to succeed in actually misleading a relevant audience, and B, either to have been intended to be misleading in virtue of its specific content, or to have been produced deliberately using a process of news production and presentation that is designed to result in false or misleading claims being spread. Finally, a third definition comes from Sterken and Talese. Fake news characterizes the activities of institutions that pose as journalistic, which by design feed and codify the antecedent biases of a pre-selected audience by exploiting their vulnerabilities, cognitive and otherwise, all with a view towards facilitating some decidedly political objective. All three definitions make the intentions of the originators of fake news essential to the phenomenon. Rini requires that the originators have the goals of wide dissemination and deception of at least some readers. Gelfert requires that the originators intend to be misleading, or at least that they deliberately use processes that are designed to produce misleading claims. Sterken and Talese require that originating institutions are designed, and so presumably intended by someone or some institution, to identify and promote antecedent audience biases. To be sure, many actual instances of fake news have involved such goals and intentions, but it seems to us that neither intentional deception nor deliberate use of a process designed to result in false or misleading claims, nor the designing of institutions to feed public biases should be built into the definition of fake news. And so here, I think it's useful to pause and think about what's the point of this paper again? What's the point of all these papers? All four of these papers, this one and these three others, are giving different definitions of what fake news is. They disagree as to what exactly the definition of fake news is. And probably there is no correct answer to this question of what is fake news. So one thing to think about is, what are the differences between these different definitions? Why would someone care about whether something fits under one definition or under another? Each of these definitions is designed to emphasize a different aspect of what are the problems with fake news and what are its causes and what might be its potential solutions. And so, for instance, three of them focus on who the creators are and what they're trying to do. And so those things might suggest in punishing creators that had bad intentions. Whereas the definition given in this paper doesn't care so much about the creators, it's more about how people pick it up and use it later on. And now again, maybe the right response is to treat creators differently, but if the account is not about the intentions of the creators, if it's just about what the readers end up doing with it, that might suggest different policies. You need policies that all creators should be paying attention to rather than the ones that are intentionally producing fake news. However, on the other hand, some of these other accounts emphasize the role of biases and focusing on biases or focusing on misleading ways in which stories can be produced. And maybe that captures aspects of the phenomenon that this account here won't capture. So think about all that as we're going through. And again, I'll have links to these other articles in the description below so that you can look at them and decide which of these accounts might be getting at more of the phenomenon that you think are important, or maybe you're interested in the phenomenon for a different reason than others. Some people are interested in it because of what it's done to the news. Some are interested in it because of what it's done to politics. Some are interested in it because of what it tells us about how social media works. There's all sorts of reasons why you might be interested in this phenomenon, and perhaps a different definition is going to be relevant based on what your interests are. Okay, so now let's come back to their arguments, the Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken arguments that their account is better than the others. Here are some reasons why. First, consider once more the Pizzagate example. For all we know, the white supremacist who instigated this news story actually believed that Clinton's emails contained an elaborate code for talking about pedophilia. Cheese pizza, for example, was claimed to stand for child pornography in virtue of the phrases sharing common first letters. Absurd as this may sound, it is certainly possible that someone could genuinely believe it. And I think this is a really interesting and important criterion to think about, that all the others say it's not fake news unless it was designed to be misleading, whereas this account is going to say someone who is just totally deluded about the status of the world could be the producer of fake news. They could believe it. And so the other accounts will say that's not really fake news, and they'll focus on the things produced by organizations that are acting in a canny way to try to produce certain outcomes. Whereas this account is going to include the deluded and deceived people who are producing this by themselves. Suppose that the progenitor of this story did in fact believe in this elaborate code. What is more, suppose that he believed that he had broken the code and could thus decipher the real contents of Clinton's emails. Working alone as he was, there was little to stop him from believing such things and putting the purported fruits of his labor online. All of this could easily have been completely in earnest and without any intention to deceive, mislead, or exploit biased thinking. On the contrary, our hypothetical author would likely have taken himself to be getting the truth out. We are not inclined to think that once the story gets up and running, it will fail to count as fake news simply because it was conceived of in a completely sincere manner. Rather, one of the real worries about the media environment we now find ourselves in is that it makes such well-meaning but highly misinformed acts of authorship much more likely to gain a significant and wide readership. And then the footnote, they mention a paper by Mukherjee called What is Fake News, which briefly considers a case like this one, which he calls Pizzagate Star. Recognizing that this case constitutes a potential counterexample to his theory, Mukherjee contends that one can, in fact, bullshit unwittingly. Here he's using bullshit in Harry Frankfurt's sense of saying something that is not aligned with being true or false at all, but rather is produced with some other purpose in mind. But Mukherjee is suggesting that bullshitting doesn't have to be intended as bullshit. This is, I think, an interesting difference between Frankfurt's account of bullshit and some other accounts of bullshit. But this alone is not enough, for on Mukherjee's analysis, producers of fake news must also intend to cover up the fact that they are bullshitting. Presumably then, Mukherjee must accept that we can unwittingly intend to cover up the fact that we are bullshitting. While we cannot offer a full-fledged argument against this claim here, we would note that we find the possibility of such complex unwitting intentions rather far-fetched. We take it to be a point in favor of our theory that we do not have to posit any such unwitting intentions in order to account for a core instance of contemporary fake news. That is, Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken are saying it doesn't matter whether the originator believed it or not. If it was not in fact produced by legitimate journalistic practices, but it gets treated by people as though it was, then it's fake news, regardless of whether the person who produced it was trying or intending to do something good at getting the truth out to the world. There can be self-deluded fake news. Second, having seen how individuals are capable of generating pieces of fake news without any intentions to deceive or mislead, we're in a better position to see how whole organizations can do the same sort of thing. Consider an organization like the National Enquirer. Suppose that the motivation of the proprietors of this organization is to maximize profit, and they incentivize their employees in order to carry out this maximization. It is not all that hard to imagine that each employee of the National Enquirer might either A, to maximize profit, or B, to maximize personal gain, with no one else intentionally putting forward content with the intention to deceive or mislead anyone else. It might just happen that putting forward patently absurd stories turns out, after some trial and error, to be the winning strategy for pursuing A and B. Think about this. Any big organization, you're giving lots of people incentives to act in certain ways. If you're giving people incentives to act in ways that are deceiving, even if you don't realize that you're ending up producing this deception, and even if the people don't realize that the things they're providing you are going to be used in ways that make them deceptive, uh, the end result can be deceptive. And so this is one of the reasons why they don't want the intentions to be relevant here. Each person does their part without anyone intending any deception. In fact, we might even stipulate that everyone in the organization takes the product they're generating to be so clearly unbelievable that they genuinely believe that no one will take the stories appearing in it at all seriously. Still, we submit, this is fake news. We do not see an easy way of modifying any of these earlier definitions to account for either the recent or the more traditional phenomenon. That said, we think that such a repair strategy, which might involve requiring that originators of fake news either intend to produce misleading stories or ought to know that this will result in their actions, is more plausible for traditional sources of fake news like the National Enquirer than for recent sources like lone tweeters. This is because these traditional sources have a more robust agential structure with a CEO, publisher, board, editors, etc., which might both engage in reflective decision-making and be subject to various norms regarding testimony and the public space. On Twitter and Facebook, some of the most prolific generators of fake news have been individuals generating fake news for one country from another, often not in their native language and with little to no reflective oversight. That is, there was a story I remember seeing at some point that some guy in Macedonia had set up like 300 major Facebook accounts producing fake news for the left and fake news for the right, and didn't really know too much about the people who were involved in all these stories, but had figured out how to make stories that reliably got lots of clicks so that he would get advertising dollars. In such circumstances, it is far more plausible that the only real motivations are monetary remuneration, and that these agents' intentions and predictive awareness of results track those thin motivations. This is not even to countenance the possibility of bot-generated fake news, which could very plausibly end up being generated by a machine learner designed only to maximize views in order to promote a certain product, with nothing about deception or mimicry of journalistic practices anywhere in its initial programming, nor even ever contemplated by its programmers as a possible strategy for view maximization. It may well be that just as sentencing algorithms rapidly make use of racial data without their designers ever contemplating that they might do so, view maximizing algorithms might search the available space of options and conclude that news-like content is the way to go. And for those of you that aren't familiar with what's gone on here, they found that uh, there's a bunch of algorithms that have been designed using machine learning to try to predict what are the factors that decide which people are most likely to pay back loans. And what they found is that when there have been problems of racism in the society in the past, so when, for instance, Black people have had a harder time paying back loans because they have a harder time getting new jobs when employers try to hire them, the algorithms have ended up deciding, oh, Black people are having trouble paying back loans, so we shouldn't give them loans, and not even realizing that race was the name of the attribute that they were using. And sometimes when they try to hide the racial variable from the computer algorithm, it ends up using zip code because it turns out that your zip code strongly correlates with what racial group you're from. And so human racism often gets recreated in the artificial intelligent algorithms, and they're suggesting similar things could happen here. Microsoft had a famous chatbot that they tried to train to use on Twitter and discovered that it was optimized to try to get lots of shares and clicks. And within a few days, it was spouting the most racist stuff because it found that was the way to get the most attention. Microsoft didn't intend for that, but it figured out how to do that on its own. And you could totally imagine that a bot that tried to maximize certain kinds of shares and clicks might end up producing things that look like news stories, even though it doesn't know what a news story is, and its creators don't know what sort of thing it's going to try to produce to get clicks. Okay, section 2, standard journalistic practices. Fake news is not just widespread sharing of any old stories, but of stories treated as products of standard journalistic practices that are not in fact such products. As above, we're not going to give necessary and sufficient conditions for a story to be the product of standard journalistic practices, but we take it that this relevant standard derives from historical and evolving ideals for the practice of journal, such as those laid out by Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel in the now classic book, The Elements of Journalism. And of course, that's subject to change and presumably also subject to specific local cultural factors, both based on who the audience is, what the nation is that it's in, what the language is that it's in, and also what the subject matter is. What it takes to be legitimate science journalism is very different from what it takes to be legitimate politics journalism is very different from what it takes to be legitimate video game journalism. However, there are some things that they all have in common, and uh, this is, I think, important to their account. We might wonder, maybe there could be enough differences in different types of journalism that perhaps their account of fake news would have different impact in different types of journalism. But what they think is in common from all types of journalism, these include a commitment to the interest of citizens or other members of a society. I think it's useful to not always think of citizens because there are, for instance, I know of, there's a newspaper that publishes in Japan in English for American expats living in Japan. That is not designed for Japanese citizens, not even necessarily designed for American citizens. It's designed for English speakers that live in Japan. But it's trying to be committed to the interest of its readers. Another commitment is careful verification of the putative information received. How careful? Maybe that's different in different types of journalism. Active seeking out of information that is or will be important for members of society. That is, most of these things don't just repeat press releases that they're given, they actively seek out stories, especially if they think that there's something coming up that their readers will want to know about. Transparency about sources, conflicts of interest, and unknowns. Independence from those covered and from sources. This has been a controversy in many different types of journalism when the people covering a certain story aren't necessarily fully separate from it, ranging from video game reviews by reviewers who were dating the creator of the game to a recent story a few months ago about a news reporter who was dating one of the members of the White House press team in the Biden White House. Proportionality in the amount of coverage given to events relative to their likely significance. That is, most journalistic sources try to focus more on the big things and less on the small things, though I think there's an interesting question of how well they do at that. And historical and social contextualization and synthesis of information. And here's a footnote. One aspect of synthesis is the idea that journalists and news organizations should aim to synthesize information from a politically neutral perspective. To what extent this is actually achievable is an interesting question. However, even if it is not, there are questions about how much effort toward neutrality is needed in order to satisfy journalistic standards and for journalistic output to count as genuine news. How much lack of neutrality is needed for a story to count as slanted or spun? How much slant or spin can a journalist or news organization get away with before their stories should be counted as fake news? It is worth noting that our account provides the structure to answer such questions about the relationship between spun or slanted news and fake news. And I think this might be an interesting question. If you take various partisan news outlets that are designed to be spun, but are designed with a readership that's supposed to know about that angle, does that count as fake news or not? That's going to depend on how essential we think this supposed neutrality is to the news organization. And I think that's something that has come and gone. In the late 19th century, nearly every newspaper in the United States was affiliated with a political party. These days, nearly every newspaper and television news story in the United States claims not to be. To qualify as genuine journalism, a process of story production need not maximally fulfill all such ideals. When news production processes live up to these ideals to a significant extent, their outputs have a strong claim to being genuine journalism. But when such processes are substantially out of line with these ideals, they have a much weaker claim to being genuine journalism. This is the case for the usual examples of fake news that we have mentioned. These are stories for which putative information has been fabricated rather than gathered, where there have been no efforts to verify the putative information or put it into context, and where there is little or no transparency regarding the sources of the putative information or who is responsible for verifying it. And so that's an interesting point. They're saying the things that are clearly fake news don't even bother trying with a lot of these things, whereas the sort of partisan news sources do still try on all these things, even if maybe they're not doing the same sort of job as certain other news agencies might be. It's important to note that following the standard journalistic practices just described offers no guarantee of reliability, and news sources following standard journalistic practices may well be untrustworthy. For instance, a news organization may, in spite of its best efforts, be fed a line by government sources with their own agendas and little regard for the truth. Arguably, this is what happened with Judith Miller's reporting on Iraq for the New York Times around 2002. I'll put a link to her Wikipedia article in the description below, but the basic idea is that she was reporting stories about supposed information that existed about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction. And it turns out she was doing all the job that a reporter needs to do, but the many of the sources that she was consulting with were intentionally lying to her or deceiving her, and she didn't quite get through it. And she actually went to jail for a few months for not revealing the names of her sources because she wanted to promote journalistic integrity of not naming sources when they'd been promised anonymity. Should there be little additional information to go on in order to fact check this line, even well-intentioned reporting can become highly untrustworthy, particularly where reporters are relying on sources who have proven accurate in the past. Just because a source has been accurate in the past doesn't mean they're not lying this time, but it can mean that you're reasonable in trusting them. We take it that such news is hardly fake in the sense that we're after. Rather, it's the result of the epistemic limitations of standard journalistic practice, which cannot guarantee anything like perfect reliability. If you've ever read a news story about something that you have worked on or that someone you know has worked on, you'll know it's full of either things ranging from outright mistakes to just getting the entire angle on this thing wrong. It's still the best that the general public is often able to get to, but it's definitely not perfectly reliable. Equally important to stress is that these standards are background expectations for journalistic writing, not ways in which audiences in general would articulate what the standards of journalistic practice are. That is, the readers don't necessarily know that this is all that goes into the news story. They just treat things as news, and Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken are saying, this is what something has to be doing in order to count as news, but the public doesn't have to be aware of all of that and doesn't have to be treating something as though it had all of that in order to actually be news. They also say, people identify journalistic writing, that which is subject to these standards, by superficial features, such as the use of headlines with their special grammatical rules. Look at a newspaper headline and see how often is there a verb missing or a noun missing. There's a very special grammar of newspaper headlines that often lends itself to parody and sometimes lends itself to misreading. Bylines, a certain prose styles and diction. If you just look at a news story, it looks like a certain sort of thing. It's got columns, it's got an author name at the top, it's usually got a date and a location, it's usually got a certain type of font, it's usually got a certain type of word choice. And if something works like that, people will sometimes treat it as a news story. We will not try to enumerate these features. Journalistic writing is also associated with the broader kinds of looks that are customary for print, online, or video news sources, including, increasingly, Twitter feeds. On Twitter, this look might amount to the mere inclusion of certain hashtags or handles, typically in conjunction with Twitter's own blue checkmark indicating a verified account. That is, maybe all it takes to look like news on Twitter is to have a blue check. I don't actually use Twitter myself, so I don't really have a sense of what looks like a news agency on Twitter, but probably it depends on, is the Twitter handle something that looks like your news today or something that looks like blue XXX420? Hence, by employing these looks and superficial features, content originators may produce stories that look like genuine journalism, whether or not they are, and whether or not content originators are aware that they are making their stories look like genuine journalism. So that is, people can accidentally produce things that look like news stories and then get treated as such. In addition to clear cases where stories are produced in ways that qualify them as genuine journalism, and clear cases where stories are produced in ways that do not qualify them as genuine journalism, there are likely to be plenty of unclear cases. Especially if work in a news organization is divided up, it is conceivable that one journalist might make up a story that others in the news organization sincerely attempt to verify, synthesize, and distribute. Likewise, information might be legitimately gathered by a news organization, but distributed directly without the appropriate process of verification and synthesis. It is also possible that information might be properly gathered, verified, and synthesized, but distributed in a way that obscures or removes responsibility for the journalistic process and transparency of sources. It is not clear that any one of these breaches, combined with a broad spread of the story, is sufficient to make the story fake news. If a rogue reporter at an established news organization fabricates an event that is then verified and synthesized in good faith by others in the organization, it is perhaps not obvious that its spread on social media creates fake news. The same uncertainty applies if news organizations hastily distribute unconfirmed reports during a crisis without appropriate caveats. That's something to think about in the immediate aftermath of an earthquake or an attack or something like that. There's often news stories up within 5 minutes, and obviously those have not gone through the same process of fact checking, and so they're not quite up to the same standards as normal news. Does that mean they're fake news? Well, not quite, because they're probably going to be subject to these standards over the next few dozen minutes as the news agency tries to get more reporters involved. Finally, an unknown but principled journalist who sets up his own website to look like an established newspaper in order to get people to read his excellently sourced, well-researched stories may not generate fake news, even if his stories get widely spread. Footnote 20. This scenario is to some degree resonant with the real-life I.F. Stone, though Stone was probably working alone out of necessity rather than by choice, and not impersonating real newspapers, but rather producing his own. Still, this raises the question of what to say about journalistic practices that are intuitively superior to our present practices, or in a word, journalistic innovation. That is, they're saying fake news is something that's not produced by standard practices, but gets treated as though it is. That might mean things that are produced by better practices than standard journalism, but get treated like journalism, get caught up in their definition as fake news. Stone's own work was innovative, but shared much of its basic pattern and ideals with ordinary journalistic practice. We suspect that at least some other innovative journalism will follow this same basic pattern and will thus be recognizable as such. It will be non-standard, but in a way that shares at least a substantial number of features with more standard instances of journalistic practice. We are happy to allow for such superlative instances of journalism to fall under standard journalistic practice on our way of talking about things. I'll have a link to I.F. Stone in the description below also. All this suggests that it may not be right to treat the even partial fulfillment of any of journalism's characteristic ideals as a necessary condition for a story to escape being fake news if it is spread widely. Rather, we take the substantial realization of these ideals to be characteristic features of genuine journalism, any of which might nonetheless be missing in some particular bit of genuine journalism. Of course, if many of the ideals are substantially unrealized on a given occasion, that will be fairly damning, and the resulting story is likely to constitute a potential instance of fake news. And then they have a footnote about a weird sort of case that involves something that is produced in a totally different way and ends up being much more reliable, and whether or not that would count as fake news. You can read it, think about it yourself. There are likely to be any number of borderline cases, however, and which side of the border a case sits on may depend not just on the fact that a standard practice has not been followed, but the specific ways in which it has not been followed. Still, in spite of this admitted lack of a clean philosophical analysis, we hope that the reader will have enough of a feel for what we are calling standard journalistic practice that she will not object to our invoking it in our attempts to better understand the nature of fake news. Section 3. What's new about fake news? We argued above that producers' intentions to deceive or to make use of production and distribution systems designed to be misleading are not essential to fake news. Any story or claim that is spread widely and treated as having been produced by standard journalistic practices, although it was not in fact so produced, can be fake news, regardless of its producer's intentions. As we have shown, it's not hard to imagine that prominent examples such as Pizzagate did not involve any intentions to deceive, mislead, or utilize inherently misleading procedures. For all we know, this may even have actually been the case. When social media users are able to easily share articles with large networks of followers who can, in turn, easily share them with their own large networks, even stories produced sincerely but non-journalistically can quickly turn into fake news. Does the inessentiality of originator intentions distinguish the new social media-based fake news from traditional fake news? We do not think so, because traditional fake news tends to be produced by organizations that, in one way or another, do intend to produce at least a certain proportion of misleading stories. It is harder to imagine cases where no such intentions are in place. But in some cases of traditional fake news, individuals rather than organizations or institutions have exploited existing journalistic structures to spread claims that they knew to be false or misleading. These cases make it easier to see how even more traditional sources of fake news could have been, and possibly even were, produced and distributed without any kind of deceptive intentions or misleading design being involved in the process. An example is Benjamin Franklin's supplement to the Boston Independent Chronicle. This was a forged supplement to a real newspaper, which Franklin printed on his personal printing press in Passy, France. One article in the supplement purported to be a letter from a New England militia captain reporting that a capture of British military goods had yielded 2 bags of colonist scalps that the British had obtained from Iroquois and Seneca warriors whom they had put up to the task. According to the letter, these bags of scalps had been carefully catalogued together with grisly descriptions of each colonist's mode of death and were prepared to be sent back to England. Franklin sent his forged supplement to several friends internationally, hinting slightly at its fakeness and also suggesting that it should make its way into the British press, which it ultimately did. It is debatable whether Franklin's supplement was intended as satire, propaganda, or both. But when the bag of scalps story gained traction in the British press at the time, it was clearly fake news. Now, Franklin probably intended to be deceptive and misleading, at least to the average British reader. But it is perhaps not so hard to imagine a different situation in which he created the forged broadsheet for his own entertainment, and in which it fell into the hands of someone who took it for a real newspaper supplement and circulated it to foreign presses. This is not so hard to imagine, since Franklin seems to have assembled and used his personal printing press partly as a passionate hobby to provide downtime from diplomacy. This would still have been fake news. Hence, we maintain that intentions to deceive, mislead, or use production and distribution processes designed to be misleading are not essential to fake news of either the new or traditional varieties. If you want more examples of that, I don't know how accurate these are, but they claim that in the 1930s, Orson Welles did a radio broadcast of the H.G. Wells story, War of the Worlds, and that people took this as real news of an alien landing in New Jersey. I don't know if that actually happened, but if it did happen, that would have been fake news. Another example might be that when Jonathan Swift published his satire, A Modest Proposal, if people thought this was a real proposal, that could also have been fake news. How then is new social media-based fake news different from traditional fake news? The difference lies in the relevant media infrastructure, the mechanisms by which fake news is spread. Traditional fake news is spread primarily by institutional news producers, such as the National Enquirer, or in Franklin's case, the various British papers. By publishing these stories in their pages, these producers spread the stories to the readership of the publications. New fake news, by contrast, is spread primarily by social media sharing. Footnote 23. Social media has facilitated a change in the mechanisms of news dissemination and uptake, which may be thought to mimic those of gossip or rumor. As a result, there may have been a substantial blending of the social functions of the two. This may be, in part, what underlies uneasiness about fake news. That, at least certain sorts of news and journalistic practice nowadays, is more like or serves the function of gossip in many respects. Although you might wonder, how new is that really, since there's always been celebrity magazines and gossip sections in society newspapers? The social functions of gossip are taken by many sociologists to be social bonding and the maintenance of social groups, networks, and relations. In addition, gossip is one of the tools that subordinates use to facilitate open criticism, threats, and attacks while shielding their identity in fear of retaliation. It is also thought to be the mechanism by which we spread information about who can be trusted within a social network, e.g. to explicitly control and punish free riders. And they mentioned Dunbar. Dunbar has lots of interesting work about human sociology and the way our minds work with groups of about 100 or so people. Finally, gossip offers us a way to increase our social capital within a group or network. It is worth noting that these functions are all markedly different from the social and epistemic functions of news, and are plausibly nothing like whatever functions underlie our journalistic practices. Hence, even if sharing fake news bears certain superficial similarities to gossiping, and even if certain types of news are now generated largely in order to be shared in ways that will reinforce social groupings, it remains to be shown whether fake news itself is merely a type of gossip. So, an originator of new fake news does not bring fake news into existence simply by publishing a story on a web page or a Twitter account. Rather, social media users collectively bring it into existence by sharing the story with their networks, members of which in turn share it with their networks and so on. That is, Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken are saying, it's not fake news once you've made it. It doesn't become fake news until people have shared it. A similar kind of spreading mechanism is possible for traditional fake news. Franklin shared, in the ordinary non-social media sense, his forged broadsheet with his friends. If they had also had hobby printing presses, they might have reproduced the forgery and shared it in turn with their friends, and so on. The story might have been spread fairly widely and been treated as news without any established newspaper or magazine ever publishing it. Perhaps more realistically, a similar forger living in the age of widespread photocopier access might share a forged news article with many friends who could in turn copy it and share it with many more. In the 1980s, many US government agencies were trying to smuggle photocopiers into China and Russia in order for dissidents there against the communist regimes to be able to do this kind of thing and spread news stories. I don't know how many real news stories got spread that way, how many fake news stories got spread that way, or how well the regimes were able to actually crack down on the existence of these photocopiers. Social media sharing drastically increases the ease and scale of such transmission. This explains why the sharing-based spreading mechanism typical of new fake news was more or less unheard of until quite recently. But the difference between sharing something with someone in general, not in a way specific to social media, and sharing something on social media is not just a matter of ease and scale. For one thing, sharing in the ordinary sense is a broad category comprising many different kinds of actions. A can share a news story with B by telling her about it, showing it to her, or giving her a copy of it. These acts, in turn, can be done in myriad different ways. The specific behaviors people use to convey to each other that a given item is something of interest that they would like the other person to look at and take an interest in are highly varied and idiosyncratic. And if you just think any instance of news stories or current events becoming part of broader discourse in conversations and in rumor mills and in gossip networks and so on has always been like that. It's come with lots of little steps, each one of which is different and each one of which introduces its own new features. But by contrast, social media sharing is a comparatively narrow category of action that can be carried out in a limited number of ways. These ways correspond roughly to the different operations on social media platforms. One can do a Facebook share, a Twitter share, an Instagram share, etc. Modulo minor platform-specific variations, everyone does social media sharing in the same way. That is, you can't emphasize different aspects of the story, tell it differently. You just click share. When you click share, the same thing happens regardless of who you are and what you mean. Maybe you put a little bit of text on it, but the story gets shared in exactly the same way. This kind of sharing we propose is enough of a uniform action to constitute a distinctive kind of speech act. And think here of John Austin with his distinctive speech acts of promising, warning, telling, and so on. Sharing is going to be a very distinctive speech act that we don't do with our mouth, we do with our mouse clicker button. The distinctiveness of the act of social media sharing is also observed by Rini, though she conceives of sharing rather differently than we do. And so this is going to be an important disagreement between Pepp, Michaelson, Sterken, and Rini. According to Rini, sharing is an ambiguous speech act that may or may not be testimony, depending on as yet unsettled communicative norms. A second key feature of social media sharing that Rini notes is there is something about social media sharing that seems to deaden people's normal application of consistency with the world filtering on testimony. She suspects that these bent aspects of social media testimony play a role in the transmission of fake news and suggests that a way to combat fake news is to unbend such testimony by trying to settle its norms in the direction of accountability. That is, if you look through Rini's paper, what you'll see is she says, often when people share a story, they mean to be saying what the headline of the story says. But at least some fraction of the time when people share a story, they mean, look at how stupid this story is, not, here's the story, you should believe it. And she says, that's what she's calling bent testimony. Testimony is when you say something intending for people to believe it, but sharing often happens with a different feature. And she wants to unbend the testimony and say, and try to encourage in us a practice of only sharing things when we believe them. Now, Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken are going to say something very different about what's going on with sharing. While we agree with Rini that sharing is not clearly a form of assertion or testimony, even though it sometimes shares certain features with each of these, we see no ambiguity here. Rather, we take it to be far more plausible that sharing simply is not testimony, nor is it a special kind of assertion. Sharing, we would suggest, is a sui generis speech act, a speech act of its own type, available only within the landscape of social media. One good reason for thinking that sharing constitutes a new sort of speech act, one that is irreducible to others in the more familiar taxonomy, is that it has significantly different sincerity conditions than any other speech act. In fact, it is not clear that sharing has sincerity conditions at all, as opposed to something weaker like aptness conditions. Suppose for a moment that one were inclined to think of sharing as a new type of asserting or testifying. Then acts of sharing should inherit their sincerity conditions from these acts of which they are a type. But this yields some patently incorrect results. For instance, suppose sincerity in asserting or testifying requires that one believe what one is asserting or testifying. However, one can appropriately share a news story simply because one likes the picture in it, or because one finds the writing style to be noteworthy, with no commitment at all to the truth of the story itself. We take there to be nothing unsettled about this. It's just that flexibility can sometimes be mistaken for unsettledness. So that is, Pepp, Michaelson, and Sterken are saying, perfectly fine, perfectly ordinary for people to share stories they disagree with because there's some other aspect of it that they want to draw attention to. I'm not sure if they're saying that it's perfectly fine to share a story with your comment, if your comment makes clear why you're sharing it. But I think at least sometimes in certain contexts, it can be clear why one is sharing a story and it's clear that it's not from agreement. In contrast, consider liking something on Facebook or Instagram. With these, one is acting insincerely if one does not actually have some positive attitude toward the post in question. What is more, with sharing, there is no easy way of paraphrasing what it is that one is asserting when one shares something. With liking, on the other hand, the act can be fairly straightforwardly paraphrased as, I like this. So think about that. Is that right? That you you would never click like on something unless you had some sort of positive feeling about it, or were trying to deceive someone about you having positive feelings about it. Whereas sharing something, you could share it with all sorts of different attitudes, and there wouldn't necessarily be an easy way to summarize what you think. If there's anything in our earlier linguistic repertoire that sharing seems most akin to, it would seem to be pointing, or perhaps pointing and saying this. We will expand on the similarity below, but first we note that if sharing were really a sort of asserting or testifying, this similarity would be highly unexpected. Nor do we think that viewing sharing as a sort of advisory or suggestion adequately captures the flavor of this act. At least as advisories are standardly understood in speech act theory, they're supposed to express the belief that whatever is being suggested to do, here to look at what has been shared, would be in the listener's interest. But one can aptly share something even when one believes that looking at it will not be in the interest of most of one's social network. I think this is a controversial point. This might be something to think about. But they claim, for instance, one can share yet another editorial on the unending chaos in the Trump White House with one's overwhelmingly liberal social network, even though one takes it that reading this editorial is likely to be a waste of time for pretty much everyone involved. Think about how often people share stories that they don't really care about anyone reading. One often shares such stories, we take it, as an act of social positioning rather than to actively suggest to one's network that they should actually read the story. And we are highly skeptical that one is contravening any established norm of sharing when one does so. And then in a footnote, they say, we would also note briefly that the more one relies on traditional speech act theory to try to understand speech and social media, the more one will run into the problem of having to make sense of machine-generated speech acts. So, for instance, bots now regularly share huge amounts of content on all the major social media networks. Yet plausibly, these bots do not have anything like the sorts of intentions required for these speech acts to count as felicitous, according to traditional speech act theory. It is open, of course, to the speech act theorists to posit that these are all mere pseudo-speech acts. But given their prevalence on social media, we are loath to think that the liking and sharing undertaken by bots is some fundamentally different kind of act than the liking and sharing undertaken by human beings on these networks. So this is an interesting question. When a bot shares something, when a bot likes something, is it doing the same thing that a human does when the human likes something or shares something? Or is it doing something totally different? There's clearly some ways in which it's doing something different, but they want to say there's a single type of speech act that is apt to be done by humans and bots, and therefore it doesn't require intentions. You might think something different, maybe that bots are always imitating humans or pretending to be humans. But I think that's not quite right. I think there are plenty of bots that don't claim to be humans, but are still doing something on social media. Sharing in social media is an easy, readily available way to make content available to one's network while simultaneously indicating that it is you who has made it available to them. So think about that. When you share something, it's not just about the story, it's about the fact that you shared the story. While obviously contiguous with earlier modes of sharing, the fact that this action has become one of the basic ways we interact with our social environment sets it apart. Whereas before, one could contrive to do something similar to sharing on a social network by harnessing one's resources either on or offline, now this is one of the standard ways of interacting with pieces of media. In slightly loaded terms, whereas sharing was once a complex action that could be undertaken with dedication, it is now a basic affordance of our interaction with the media landscape. And I'll include a link below to the concept of what an affordance is. It's the sort of basic feature of our environment that a ladder just obviously affords the ability of climbing up it. A door just obviously affords the ability of opening it. A social media post just obviously affords the ability of liking it or sharing it. As mentioned above, we see social media sharing as having much in common with another type of offline speech act, declarative pointing. Broadly speaking, pointing is a communicative bodily movement that projects a vector from a body part indicating a certain direction, location, or object. Declarative pointing is often distinguished from imperative pointing, the former being aimed at bringing the audience's attention to something, while the latter being aimed at causing the audience to do something. Brink argues that the function of declarative pointing is simply to indicate an object to an addressee, i.e. to direct the attention of the addressee to that object. Further goals that one may have in pointing vary widely, and on Brink's analysis are not themselves parts of the function of pointing considered as a type of act. Such further goals might include getting attention for oneself from the addressee, gauging the addressee's evaluative reactions to the objects, coordinating with the addressee on some course of action involving the audience, and so on. The role of pointing itself, however, is just to secure the addressee's attention to the object. We find Brink's analysis of pointing persuasive, and we are struck by the similarities with social media sharing. The speech act of sharing might well be seen as a new form of internet-enabled declarative pointing. Ordinary declarative pointing exploits contiguity in time and space of a speaker, an object, and an addressee. The speaker and the addressee must be able to see each other, and both of them must be able to see the object. Social media sharing exploits the connectedness of a speaker, an object of interest, e.g. a story, and her addressees via the internet. A speaker and her addressees must be connected to each other by a social media network, and the object of interest must have a web address or be embedded in the shared post. Given the former setup, declarative pointing by the speaker functions to focus the attention of the addressee on the object. Given the latter setup, sharing by the feature functions to focus the attention of the addressees on the object. Like ordinary declarative pointing, social media sharing may be done with a wide range of aims beyond simply focusing the attention of an addressee on an object. One may aim to get the addressees to believe in what the object says, to share the object further on their own networks, to react with praise or disgust to the object, and so on. But sharing itself is purely indicative. One might object to this analysis on the grounds that people seem to react to sharing as if it conveys at least some level of endorsement, unless this is explicitly disavowed. As noted above, Rini thinks that the norms around sharing are unsettled. She also thinks that, at present, our accountability conventions seem to tolerate this instability. We may roll our eyes at a retweet is not an endorsement, but we don't yet place most embarrassed retweeters in the same category as outright liars or bullshitters. If, in fact, there is a collective eye roll at those who claim not to have endorsed things they share without further comment, then this might suggest that sharing is not purely indicative, like declarative pointing, but also functions to convey some sort of positive endorsement of the thing indicated. Alternatively, this might merely suggest that we are apt to suspect that there are further intentions behind many acts of sharing, and that the respondent is being disingenuous about these further intentions, even though all of this is unrelated to any constitutive norms of social media sharing. Still, we take Rini's objection here to be a serious and interesting one, even if the evidence that she offers for it is probably not beyond question. So this is a fair criticism, that is Rini's criticism that sharing involves some amount of endorsement. One option in reply is to treat sharing as a speech act with the function of indicating an object in an at least slightly better than neutral evaluative tone. However, this proposal might also run into trouble with sincerity conditions. And now they're about to describe a weird case. I'm not sure how I think about this case, but let's see what you think. Suppose that someone encounters a news article toward which they are perfectly neutral. It strikes them as mediocrely researched, mediocrely written, and of no particular relevance to their own life, but perhaps of enough interest to some people's lives to merit having been written. This person is also feeling worried about having been silent on Twitter recently, so they decide to share this article, perhaps precisely because it seems so neutral and inoffensive. If sharing conveys at least a mildly positive evaluation of the shared item, which the person does not feel, then we should judge this person to be insincere in sharing as they do. but this does not seem right. The person wishes to share something to achieve joint attention to a bit of online content with her followers, and this is something she feels comfortable sharing. Insincerity does not seem like the right diagnosis, reinforcing the point that sharing does not seem to have sincerity conditions. Given this, it does not in itself convey positive or negative evaluations. I'm not sure what you think about that example. I'm not totally convinced. It maybe feels a bit more convincing to me if I imagine that this is a person who has promised, I'm going to share one picture a day, and they haven't come up with one today. And maybe today is a day when there's a really intense news story and they don't want to be seen as either skipping out or sharing something that is controversially related to it. So they just share the most neutral thing they can think of. I don't know. Maybe that's still insincere. Another consideration is that sharing by others is itself a central aim of many who produce online content. When one shares a post, article, video, or the like, one is often giving its creator what they want. This might figure into how one's audience interprets one's shares. The addressees may think, this sharer is rewarding the producer of that content, so she must approve of the content. But this is not always the situation. Sometimes the wide sharing of some online content is very much not what its producer wants. Think of embarrassing selfies that make their way onto the internet and go viral. In such situations, we are not likely to interpret an uncommented share as expressing even mild approval. Rather, we are likely to interpret it as expressing disgust, schadenfreude, or some other negative emotion. This is because the sharer is doing something against what the producer of the content presumably wants. This suggests once again that sharing in itself does not have anything like a stable evaluative force. So I think in this argument, they're saying, maybe you think that sharing indicates positive approval because normally when you share something, you're doing what the creator wants. But they're pointing out at least sometimes when you share, you're doing the opposite of what the creator wants. And so at least sometimes sharing is going to automatically indicate negative attitudes. So we can't assume that sharing by default is positive or in general is positive or anything like that. If this is right, it offers an interesting potential explanation of why the advent of social media has made fake news so prominent. First, there's a natural connection between standard journalistic practices and trust. If followed, these practices should, more often than not, yield information we can use and rely on. This information would come from the world rather than from the imaginations of the writers. It would be verified and synthesized into a useful form, and we would know who was responsible if these processes turned out not to have been followed. Not surprisingly then, the surface appearances that correlate with results of such processes tend to inspire trust. When one encounters a story with this kind of surface appearance, especially if it reports an event whose occurrence would give one some form of emotional satisfaction. For instance, if it says that one's most hated politician has done something terrible, it's easy to let oneself trust the story. Even if one does not trust the story, it may be pleasurable to see the satisfying claim looking like a product of standard journalistic practices. Think about this, think about those, the market for sort of novelty Time magazine covers that have your picture on Time magazine Person of the Year, ignoring the fact that in 2007 we were all Person of the Year. But if we're right about social media sharing being a purely indicative speech act, further sharing of the story may not seem especially risky. Thus, the recent epidemic of fake news might be an unsurprising result of the interaction between the newly emergent distributional infrastructure of social media, the correspondingly new speech act of social media sharing, and our shifting attitudes towards journalism as an institution. Moreover, to the extent that much social media sharing is done with a further aim of expressing evaluative and reactive attitudes toward people and institutions, that is, we're sharing things to show how we feel about other things, stories treated as having been produced by standard journalistic practices are especially fruitful objects for joint attention. Here is why. People in the same social networks often have similar evaluative attitudes toward music, art, religion, politics, and so on. As with face-to-face social interaction, it is pleasing to share one's evaluative feelings with others online and to get evaluative agreement in return. If two friends are eating a meal together, they can happily gripe about a politician or rhapsodize about a musician in non-specific terms. He's so clueless. Her being in power really scares me. What a sound she had. They don't make musicians like that anymore. I would say that if you're eating a meal together, you can also gripe or rhapsodize about the meal itself, or about the setting, or about anything else. There's lots of things that you can easily non-specifically talk about just to share feelings with your friend. And sharing feelings with your friends is one of the things that we humans like to do. But on social media, the same kind of social bonding seems to require continually introducing new objects of attention. One cannot just express dislike for Hillary Clinton. One has to point to something that gives new content to that dislike. A negative story that has the appearance of having been produced by standard journalistic practices is an especially good vehicle for providing such content. And this might also explain why it is that very similar versions of the same story often go around several weeks or several months apart, just because people need something new to share. Of course, this explanatory suggestion is only a conjecture. Which psychological factors figure in the spread of fake news is an empirical question that we are not in a position to answer. Still, in the same conjectural spirit, a possible objection to the picture just sketched comes from a recent study suggesting that, at least in the United States, it is members of far-right groups that share by far the most of what the researchers characterized as fake news. Here, of course, depending on how the researchers characterized it is going to be questionable because we don't know if they're capturing all the fake news, and maybe they were biased in their estimation of which things counted as fake news. But given that these groups, the US far-right groups, also tend to be the most suspicious of mainstream media, one might doubt that mimicking the surface appearance of such media would be effective with them. However, we suspect that even those who think journalistic practices are not being followed at all by the most prominent institutions of journalism still view them as requirements for genuine journalism. The characteristic surface features of journalism may not, by these people's likes, typically indicate genuine journalism, but they still are associated with it. News is supposed to be produced in a certain way, and this is how stories produced in that way are supposed to look. A story that looks the right way and says by given readers' lights the right thing might be treated as having been produced in the right way without much additional scrutiny. Section 4, Sharing and Standard Journalistic Practices. According to our definition of fake news, a story S is fake news just in case 1. S is broadly spread, where broad, of course, depends on the relevant audience. 2. Those spreading S treat S as having been produced by standard journalistic practices. And 3. S was not produced by standard journalistic practices. And of course, 2 and 3 depend on this account of what journalistic practices are. We have claimed that part of what is distinctive about the new fake news is that it is spread by way of sharing on social media, where sharing is itself understood as a distinctive sort of speech act. It is this profound shift in the infrastructure by which the stories constituting fake news are spread that makes the new fake news importantly different from more traditional fake news. Thus, on our understanding, there really is something distinctively new about the new fake news. It has come into existence with the advent of social media and, in particular, with the speech act of sharing. Without this new sort of infrastructure, the spread of fake news is constrained by access to means of widespread copying and dissemination, namely printing presses or industrial printers, delivery trucks, vans, and drivers, and access to vendors or vending machines. With this new sort of sharing infrastructure in place, these constraints fall away, and fake news can be generated far more easily by far more people and in more sorts of ways than ever before. Footnote 36, again, to stress a point we have gestured at before, it is not exactly that this new sharing infrastructure could not have been mimicked with certain aspects of the older infrastructure. A copy machine at the post office can be used rather effectively to spread fake stories. See Garner, 98 Years of Mail Fraud. Email makes this sort of thing even easier. I don't know about you, but when I first got an email account, I definitely saw lots of things that I would now call fake news that were being spread as email forwards. But even if it is possible to spread fake news by these means, and we have no doubt that it is, something significant has clearly changed with the advent of social media. This is what we tried to capture above in pointing out that social media infrastructure has made sharing into a kind of basic affordance, as easy as and very similar to pointing at something in your visual field to achieve joint attention with an audience. So the new fake news is contiguous with the old, but also distinct in important ways. In this section, we highlight two corollaries of this view. These will serve to clarify the proposal and address some potential objections. Corollary 1. Our notion of news is diachronic and dynamic. It is diachronic in the sense that news items are treated as objects that exist over time. Diachronic is a word that's used in lots of contexts to distinguish things that stretch through time from synchronic things that are true at a time. It is dynamic in that news items can, in surprising ways, change properties over time. In particular, the status of S as an instance of fake news can change over time. According to our view, at time t, S is not fake news if at least one of the following conditions obtains. Either S is not widely shared, or S is widely shared, but those sharing it do not treat it as the result of standard journalistic processes. Suppose for the moment that S meets one of these conditions at t, and so S is not fake news. On our proposal, at a later time, t prime, S can turn into an instance of fake news, either by becoming widely shared or by being treated as the result of standard journalistic processes. For instance, a satirical story from The Onion, which has many of the trappings of real news, might be shared widely at time t, but not be treated as the result of standard journalistic practice. So will not count as fake news at t. At t prime, however, it might well become the case that the story, still widespread and still intended by its originators as satire, for whatever reason, comes to be treated as the result of standard journalistic practices. On our account, this same story will now count as fake news. Footnote 37. There are in fact real-world cases of something like this, though many involve the simultaneous spread of a story and treatment of it as non-satirical. So, for instance, Iran's Fars news agency apparently republished word for word a 2012 Onion article claiming that polling suggested that rural Americans preferred Ahmadinejad to Obama. In fact, the Washington Post reports that this sort of thing, minus the outright plagiarism, is actually fairly common and not just in foreign countries. Assuming this story became widespread in Iran, it would now count as fake news in Iran in our account. This brings out another interesting aspect of the view that we will not have time to focus on in the main text. On our view, it is possible for a story simultaneously to count as fake news relative to some region and not to count as fake news relative to some other region. This should come as no real surprise, given that our account of what it is to be fake news is essentially relationalist in nature, as opposed to its rival, more essentialized accounts. That is, what it is to be fake news is to be treated as news without being news, and being treated as news can be done by one group while not being done by another group, as opposed to the other accounts which say the story itself is fake news, regardless of how people treat it. Essentially, we propose to think of a piece of news in a similar way to how Kaplan thinks about words. They are objects that exist over time, and different stages of a word or story can have different properties. As such, on our view, a news item can turn into fake news not by its intrinsic features changing, e.g. the set of sentences that constitutes the story, or the propositions expressed by those sentences, but by becoming widely shared or by being treated in a new way by those sharing it. The aim of our notion is in part to shift attention away from a narrow focus on the informational content of a story and the intentions and acts of the original author. These are not the full story, as we've argued, about what makes a piece of news what it is. The history of the news story, including the way people treat it on social media, is partly constitutive of whether at a given time a particular news story will count as fake news or real news. Corollary 2. We just articulated the idea that a consequence of our diachronic and dynamic conception is that what at t was not fake news can turn into fake news. Our view also entails the contrapositive of this. What was once fake news can turn into not fake news. Here's how this might conceivably happen. At a time t, a story S is an instance of fake news, i.e. at t it's widely shared and treated as a product of standard journalistic practices when in fact it is not. Now, at a later time, t prime, a journalist J looks into S. J is a hardworking, thorough, and conscientious journalist working on a normal deadline. She does her due diligence, that is, she does what she can given restrictions of time and resources to check on the accuracy of S. When she does that, she keeps encountering sources that are supportive of S. The bad sources she encounters in her research all confirm S. This might be because she's in an informational environment where fake news is ubiquitous. Bear in mind that standard journalistic practice is not a guarantee of infallibility. Jay can follow standard journalistic practice and get it wrong. This is what happens in the case under consideration. Jay publishes the story and it is shared further. However, and this is the interesting part, S is no longer an instance of fake news on our account, since in order to be an instance of fake news, S cannot be the result of standard journalistic practices. So at time t, S was fake news, then at time t prime, when it's published by S, it's no longer fake news, even though S's content with all its inaccuracies is constant across t and t prime. Alternatively, one is welcome to imagine the same basic scenario, but where S is actually accurate the whole time. This is equally well a possibility on our view. I think this example is a little weird. They're saying one and the same story can be published, it can be written up not as a result of journalistic practices, but by being double-checked, fact-checked, edited, and so on without changing any of the words, it can become real journalistic practices. I think that's much harder than becoming treated as fake news or stopping being treated as news. Those sorts of things are probably easier to change than the practices that went into the particular words that you read. Is this a feature or a bug of our proposal? We see it as an advantage of the view. Our view suggests focusing on the historical development of S and thinking of a news story as having different properties at different times. Our proposal adds to this that the presence and absence of standard journalistic practices creates crucial junctures in such histories. As a result, our account allows not fake news to turn into fake news and vice versa. When fake news turns into not fake but nonetheless false news, as in the first variant of the case described above, we can provide an accurate diagnosis of what has gone wrong. S is now an example of how standard journalistic practices can fail without the journalist or news organization being to blame. Journalists and news organizations are fallible, and in the case described, we have a way of understanding what went wrong. Jay's sources were bad. We are proposing that it is crucial to mark this defect as importantly different from the defect that S suffers from at the earlier time t. In the case where S turns out to have been accurate the whole time, we see how standard journalistic practice can manage to grant a story real epistemic bona fides, even when the causal origins of that story are epistemically suspect. In both instances, real journalism can, on our account, salvage a fake story. When the story was false, we grant that it will not have been worth salvaging, but when it's true, it seems to us that we should want a story of how something of real epistemic worth can be gained. Our account provides that story. That said, this is a feature of the view that would be fairly easy to avoid if one were so motivated. Here is one strategy. We have not given you necessary and sufficient conditions for being the same news story over time. That is, we have not answered the question, when does a set of sentences or propositions count as the same news story? It might be that the individuation conditions for news stories are such that in a case like the one described, J's research and reporting results in a news story S prime, which is not identical to S. S is a source of S prime and S is fake news, but because S prime is the result of standard journalistic processes, albeit in a situation where these have not yielded accuracy and appropriate contextualization, S prime is not fake news. That is, this entire section is thinking, under what conditions is this the same story? If you take a news story and translate it into a new language so that it has new words, is it the same story or a different story? There's all sorts of things where I look at a story that's in the Eagle, the local paper in Bryan College Station, and I see some number of them are reprints of stories from the Texas Tribune or from the Associated Press. However, they're done in the distinctive Eagle typeface, font, and website design. Does that make it a news story? It's often hard to say. Some people might say, if you've got the same words, then it's the same story. Others might say, the entire setting is part of what makes it the story. And so they're saying, if you just think the words make it the same story, then something can start out as fake news and become real news because a real editor might put their eyes over it and do some fact checking and and now approve it as written, even though they didn't change any words. So a diachronic and dynamic conception of a news story will need to be supplemented with an account of the individuation and perdurance conditions for news stories. Perdurance is a fancy philosophical word for how an object remains in existence even as its parts change over time. One needs to know what counts as the same news story over time. Our view highlights this question but does not yet answer it. Indeed, on our view, the question is not settled prior to the development and uptake of new communicative technologies. In the shift from a primarily print, picture, and audio-based conception of news to one driven by social media, what counts as news, and so fake news, has changed. They've said a tweet can be news now, and so a tweet can be fake news. 30 years ago, no one would have understood that. The same is likely true of the question of what counts as the same news story over time. The medium, and in particular the distributional infrastructure that it engenders, is in part constitutive of the nature of news and news stories, and is bound to play a role in determining their means of individuation. These are issues we will not settle here, but we note it as an advantage of our view that it highlights the importance of these questions. Okay, section 6, conclusion. We have argued that fake news is best conceived of as something that can arise independently of anyone's having intended to produce it. What is more, we have attempted to sketch a way of defining fake news in terms of the way that a story is treated, rather than in terms of how it's created. We think that this definition is superior to earlier ones, not just because it can handle cases where there was no intention to produce a piece of fake news, and even cases where there was no intentional agent producing the fake news, but also because it highlights the ways in which what will count as fake news can change over time in significant ways. This can happen when journalistic standards change, when the look of news changes, and when the means of distributing news stories change. Stories that once would not have counted as fake news can become such, and vice versa. Our definition as it stands is schematic in certain ways, in particular when it comes to the notion of standard journalistic practices. We have suggested that this is, in fact, a virtue of the view. It offers us a decent first-pass understanding of fake news, but also allows for a more refined use of the concept as it becomes clearer what it is that we ought to consider standard journalistic practice in the present context. Many contemporary debates on what in particular should count as fake news hinge, we take it, on just these questions. So making this explicit rather than merely tacit can hopefully serve as a step toward a more useful refinement of this concept, one that might help to clarify how we might reform our social media space in order to preserve its enormous potential to connect people without descending into a realm of spin and disinformation that can pose a fundamental threat to free society. We will close by highlighting one aspect of our account that is not schematic. Unlike its rivals, our account makes widespread dissemination an essential feature of being fake news. While we expect this to be a controversial aspect of this view, we also take it to be a point worth defending. It is worth defending not only because it allows our definition to capture an important set of cases, those that involve no sort of intentions to deceive or mislead, that other views cannot easily account for, but also because it helps us to understand the import of the radical changes of the infrastructure of fake news that we have witnessed in the last decades. These changes, of course, are not changes in the nature of fake news on our account, but they are fundamental changes in the way that that nature can be manifested in our world. They represent a huge shift in how fake news can be generated. Accordingly, we take our account to be helpful to a broader sort of ameliorative project to which we are sympathetic. We should hope for our philosophical theories not just to achieve extensional or intentional adequacy with respect to some concept. Rather, at least for a certain class of concepts, we should hope for those theories to aid in our attempts to usefully grapple with the world around us. That is, we don't want just an extensionally accurate account of a concept. We don't just want a definition that says yes or no to all the right things. We also don't even just want an intentionally correct account of a concept. It's not just what are you thinking of when you think of the concept. They want an ameliorative project, something that can help us improve the world by using this concept. We think our proposed definition of fake news meets this criterion better than its rivals. First, it highlights the important role that regulating unintentional fake news is going to have to play in creating a healthier epistemic environment. Second, and related, it points to the importance of infrastructure in these debates. The infrastructure of news used to be controlled by publishers, who could be held to account for the things that were reported in their papers. With the advent of social media, this is no longer the case. In the West, at least, social media companies have been largely exempted from the sorts of laws that hold publishers to account for the contents of the stories they publish. We would hardly recommend that these networks be subjected wholesale to libel or truth in advertising laws of the sort that more traditional publishers were subject to. But that said, if constraining fake news is the sort of worthy policy goal that we take it to be, then the possibility of subjecting these networks to greater scrutiny with regards to stories that A, become widespread, and B, exhibit the superficial features of real news might be worth considering. For if we are right about fake news, then such a policy might allow for a significant reduction in the spread of fake news, with only minimal impacts on the sorts of individual free speech rights that most of us will, rightly we think, take to be well worth protecting. So that's right. So this has become a matter of political discussion in the past year or two. There's a lot of discussion of revising Section 230 of the Telecommunications Decency Act that protects websites and social media networks from regulation of the content of what they say. These authors are proposing that if we want to regulate fake news, maybe what we should do is regulate anything that is widespread and looks like news, where looks like news can be described in a certain sort of way. And that might preserve a lot of the openness of social media while eliminating the problems of fake news without getting into the question of what were the intentions of the creator. Now, of course, maybe we think that's not the right approach, but that's where we have to think about this.